basically from livestock production, we have 80% of the emissions, total emissions from agriculture being accounted for by livestock production. And it amounts to 18% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Now, producing 1 kilogram of beef, I believe, leads to emissions of greenhouse gases with a warming potential equivalent to 36.4 kilograms of CO2. It releases fertilizing compounds equivalent to 340 grams of sulfur dioxide and 59 grams of phosphate. It consumes 169 megajoules of energy. And 1 kilogram of beef is responsible for the equivalent of the amount of CO2 emitted by the average European driver per car for every 250 kilometers. And it burns enough energy to light a 100-watt bulb for 20 days. The livestock sector is by far the single largest anthropogenic user of land. Livestock production accounts for 70% of all agricultural land and 30% of the world's surface land area. And 70% of previous forested land in the Amazon is occupied by cattle pastures, and crops for animal feed cover a large part of the remainder. Other environmental impacts of livestock: amount of water needed to produce 1 kilogram of maize is 900 liters, rice 3,000 liters, chicken 3,900, pork 4,900, and beef a whopping 15,500 liters. So it's also intensive in the use of water if you take the entire cycle. Livestock is responsible for 64% of ammonia emissions, which contribute to acid rain. Livestock is among the largest sectoral source of land and water pollution with nitrates and phosphorus from slurry and silage which runs off, and from the use of nitrogen fertilizers. So if one takes the sum total of all these impacts, then clearly we have not really accounted for all the environmental impacts of meat and its consumption, production and consumption. Impacts of livestock on food availability: well, 1/3 of the world's cereal harvest and over 90% of soya is used for animal feed, despite inherent inefficiencies. It takes close to 10 kilograms of animal feed to produce 1 kilogram of beef, and 4 to 5.5 kilograms of grain to produce 1 kilogram of pork, and 2.1 to 3 kilograms of grain to produce 1 kilogram of poultry meat. Now, all of this is really happening on a much larger scale than was the case, say, even 2 or 3 decades ago. Now, a farmer can feed up to 30 persons throughout the year on 1 hectare with vegetables, fruits, cereals, and vegetable fats. If the same area is used for the production of eggs, milk, or meat, the number of persons fed varies from 5 to 10. So there is a significant difference there. Now, what I'd like to say is there is a need for change in consumption patterns, and the reason why I'm talking about perhaps reducing meat consumption is because this is something which every individual can do. The power of British consumers, what would it amount to? Well, the average household would reduce CO2 emissions by more if they halve their meat consumption than if they halve their car usage. So, this is an important fact. A family of 4 eating a quarter-pounder beef burger each is responsible for the CO2 emissions equivalent of driving from London to Cambridge, 16 kilograms of CO2 emissions. How can change be achieved? Well, through the power of consumers and citizens, reducing meat consumption, choosing organic or free-range products, campaigning and raising awareness. A major source of bringing about mitigation would be to place a price on carbon. And if there is carbon dioxide emissions taking place as a result of the entire meat cycle, then I think that cost to society should be internalized and there should be a tax or whatever. And I think overall what Gandhi said is relevant in every respect of actions that are required to combat climate change. Be the change you want to see in the world.
Therefore, I don't disagree with his analysis at all. We do need to consider how to reduce that methane and other greenhouse gas emissions from the livestock sector. I would stress, however, maybe a slightly broader, it's one issue, and he did indeed mention, I would push that we can equally look at all issues of energy use. And therefore there's many areas of research, as Hennin said, we can reduce the footprint of the livestock sector on effectively the environment, and we can improve the way we eat in moderation for a healthy diet.
One is that the calculation of 18%, the contribution of livestock to climate change emissions, is not meat, it's livestock. Livestock serves all kinds of other purposes, food purposes, milk and eggs have been mentioned, but there's also draft power, there's manure, which are essential inputs to crop farming in many parts of the world. There's fibers that haven't been mentioned. And there's also the asset and insurance function that livestock constitute for many poor people in the world. And I think we need to take this into account. You've pointed at the population increase that we have. 9.2 billion people by the year 2050 are expected. A lot of them will be much more affluent. They will enter the middle class. And the first thing they do when they enter the middle class is enriching their diets. And I don't think that is something that we can tell them not to do. If it is in modest amounts, I think it is absolutely acceptable that they do that.
That this demand for meat and the quintupling of meat consumption globally in the second half of the 20th century is all to do with our demand. And I would argue quite strongly that that demand has been created. It's not us that are demanding it. It's actually what we're being given. To some extent, if you're very poor, you want to improve your diet as you get wealthier by eating more meat. But for a lot of people in affluent countries, the demand is much more created than that. It's not come from us. And although people are very wary of talking about regulation, I would also say actually governments already use extraordinary economic levers to promote precisely this sort of overconsumption of meat. But if you look at where those subsidies go, the subsidies from the rich countries, from the US and the EU, go to a very small number of crops, and it's precisely those crops that have become incredibly cheap and that have therefore been available for export to feed this livestock revolution.
The livestock sector is currently a major contributor to climate change, but it is a highly dynamic sector that's on a trajectory of rapid expansion, and that if a business as usual projection is taken, it means that by the middle of this century, the impact will be at least double what it is today. And that is clearly not tolerable. Which means that on a global scale, to hold production constant and greenhouse gas emissions from production constant, we would need to reduce mean consumption by about 10%. Now, it seemed to us that the only geopolitically feasible way of achieving this is by the strategy of contraction and convergence. That it's just simply no amount of military superiority by rich countries will stop poor countries wanting to eat more meat. And why should they if the rich countries don't reduce?
Compassion World Farming is first and foremost a farm animal welfare organisation, and we're really concerned that the global increase in meat production and consumption is going to happen at the expense of animal welfare. And we know that already 80% of the growth in livestock production is from animals kept in industrial systems. And I think perhaps we should just think about what do we mean by factory farming, and we mean breeding, rearing and trading animals as if they were just units of production. But of course they're not. They're actually sentient beings capable of suffering. And European law recognizes this. It recognizes that animals are sentient beings. In fact, this has also been recognized by the World Animal Health Organization, which represents the chief vets of nearly all the countries in the world, and by many national veterinary associations too. So yes, I think we do need to reduce our meat consumption. Those of us who eat a lot. We're not talking about people in sub-Saharan Africa or poor people throughout the world generally who eat hardly any anyway. We're talking about people like us. And I would say that, yes, we all need to think carefully about our personal carbon footprints, but let's have a carbon footprint combined with a compassionate footprint.